Hello everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In our last episode, we saw that there was a conflict with the royal family regarding Princess Helena and her getting married. There were those who opposed and those who agreed, and Princess Alexandra had 2 more children in this episode, a boy and a girl. The children always seemed to arrive earlier than expected, much to Queen Victoria's disappointment, because she wanted to be there for the births. During this time, we see clearly how much the Prince of Wales thought about his own desires and left his wife in pain and sickness to do what he wanted. No wonder Queen Victoria had a negative outlook on her son. She knew before they married how he was as a man, and she wondered if they should marry. She loved Princess Alexandra even though they had political disagreements. Queen Victoria always was concerned about her, and I'm anxious to see what's happening today. The prince was childish, and that explained how he behaved during Princess Alexandra's difficult time. He was 26 years old, but he was very immature, and the young and the immature tend to shut their eyes to the frightening or unpleasant. The prince was not only frightened, he was bored, and boredom was the condition he could least tolerate. He genuinely loved his wife, and so long as he could be with her, he was responsibly happy. It was on record that he had his desk moved into her sick room so that he could write letters by her bedside. For long periods he found time hanging very heavily on his hands. He could not face long hours spent in the decorous company of Lady Macclesfield and Sir William Knollys, so he escaped to more congenial friends and pleasures elsewhere. Queen Louise had been receiving letters from the prince, Lady Macclesfield, and one by Queen Victoria herself, and that made her realize that she had been mistaken in supposing that her daughter's illness was not serious. And on the 18th of March, she arrived in England. King Christian followed a few days later. On the 18th, Knollys saw the princess for the first time since the beginning of her illness. She was lying on her back, unable to move, but she was in brilliant spirits at the thought of seeing her mother. Her long hair was loose about her shoulders, and the solemn Sir William recorded that the upper part of her figure would have formed a study for a painter. The princess was happy to see her mother and father, but it didn't produce any improvement in her condition. Lady Macclesfield described the king as being very soft-hearted, and both parents as very indulgent. And for the first time she complained about the princess herself. Her obstinacy is enough to provoke a saint. It wasn't until April 20th that there was a real sign of improvement. Then at last the princess was wheeled to the window to enjoy the sunny spring weather and to delight in the fresh green of the trees, which had been black and leafless when she last had seen them. On the 10th of May, still in bed but looking ravishingly pretty with a pink bow in her hair, she was wheeled in to attend the ceremony of her baby's christening. Later that same day, the prince left to attend the opening of the Paris exhibition. Not all of his time in Paris was devoted to official functions. The accounts subsequently had of this visit were very unsatisfactory. Knollys recorded disapprovingly supper after the opera with some of the female Paris notorieties, etc., etc. At this time there were rumblings and grumblings from the great British public. They felt that they were being kept in the dark about the illness of their beloved Princess of Wales. She was certainly far more popular than either her husband or her mother-in-law. When the prince went to Ascot Week, he received a very flat reception, as the princess was not there, but suffering at home. By the beginning of July, the princess was recovering enough to be able to look forward to attending a military review, and at the last moment, though, it was canceled because of the news of the shooting of the Emperor Maximilian. I was extremely glad, both for the sake of the princess and of the queen, that the review did not take place, Knollys commented. The princess would have received an ovation, but it would have been at the expense of the queen. The princess was, in fact, hardly fit enough for such exertion. Her leg was still completely stiff and apt to swell, giving her much pain. Not till the 2nd of July did Queen Victoria at last find her sitting up in a wheeled chair, looking very lovely, but still altered. The queen's comment was sadly correct. This long illness had marked a turning point in the princess's life, and she emerged from it in some ways a changed person. For the first time she had experienced acute and prolonged physical pain. Even worse, during this long trial, her husband's love had not been strong enough to keep him by her side. The princess's discretion was absolute. No one could tell if she knew of the St. Petersburg beauties, the Paris notorieties, and the fashionable female celebrities. It was more than his discreet infidelity, it was his open neglect. Now all London and all of Paris knew that while his wife lay sick in Marlborough House, the prince had been amusing himself elsewhere. Basically, the princess's illness meant that she was left with a completely stiff knee, forced to face the probability that she would be lame for life, a gloomy prospect for a young woman who delighted in dancing, riding, skating, gymnastics, and all athletic activities. The princess was unaware of the most serious disability resulting from her illness. From her mother, she had inherited the disease known as osteosclerosis, a form of deafness which can be brought on or accentuated by illness or by pregnancy. Now, following her attack of rheumatic fever and the birth of her third child, the princess grew increasingly deaf. Only those who have been deaf themselves can realize the full meaning of deafness, the isolation it imposes, and the evil effects it can have upon the character. A deaf person is cut off not only from friends, but from many arts and pleasures, from the theater, for instance, and tragically enough for the princess, from all forms of music. The deaf find it difficult to learn a foreign language or to follow those who speak with unfamiliar accents. Difficult, too, to make friends with children who are too shy to speak up, and with sick people who cannot speak up even if they would. The judgment of deaf people often goes astray because, unlike the blind, they do not develop exceptional powers of comprehension like physical antenna to take place the lost sense. The natural tendency is to help and sympathize with blindness, a handicap which is immediately apparent to strangers. But only the deaf really sympathize with the deaf. Almost always when anyone fails to hear what is said, the speaker repeats the remark in a loud, impatient tone. The deaf person then retires yet further into his shell, more and more convinced that he's a nuisance to his fellow men, and more prone to develop those two unattractive characteristics, misanthropy and self-pity. These things didn't pertain to the princess, though. It was a measure of her triumphant success in overcoming her handicap. For a royal person, deafness is an even greater disability and embarrassment than was the stammer which afflicted the princess's grandson, King George VI. Stammering can at least partially be cured, but the operations which can now restore hearing to those suffering from osteosclerosis were not known a century ago, while the only hearing aid available for the princess was a cumbersome and ineffective ear trumpet, which she was too vain to use. She was clever disguising and circumventing her deafness, but some of its drawbacks were unavoidable. She tended to become too dependent on one or two chosen friends whose voices she could hear because they were familiar to her, and to let herself fall too much under their influence. Secondly, her deafness meant that she became intellectually stunted. The princess learnt from people rather than from books, as her mother-in-law frequently complained. She was no reader. Even if she had possessed perfect hearing, the princess would never have been a clever, well-instructed woman, but she need not have become a stupid one. Her cleverness had always been underrated, partly because of her deafness. Lord Esher was to write, in point of fact, she says more original things and has more unexpected ideas than any other member of the family. However unintellectual her own personal friends might be, by virtue of her position, she was thrown much into the company of the most famous and brilliant characters of her generation. She was on intimate and friendly terms with Gladstone, Tennyson, Balfour, Rosebery, Asquith, to mention but a few names out of many. Had she been able to hear, it was impossible. She should have learnt something from the conversation going on all around her in such company. The last and most serious effect of the princess's deafness was the way in which it prevented her from sharing fully in her husband's life. She delighted in the social round, hardly less than he did, and she frankly enjoyed her position as the acknowledged leader of the fashionable society. But as her affliction closed in upon her, she found herself taking less and less pleasure in such things. The effort involved was too great, and the satisfaction to be gained by such an effort grew progressively less as her hearing decayed. As Sir Philip Magnus puts it, increasing deafness destroyed a large part of the princess's ability to continue to share without exhaustion her husband's intense enjoyment of the society over which he reigned for half a century. Cut off by deafness from things both intellectual and social, she tended more and more to make her home and her children the central interests of her life, when for her amusement she turned to dogs and horses and the undemanding pleasures of the countryside. The ties of affection which bound husband and wife together were never broken. She did not allow herself to become seriously estranged from the prince, but as the years went by, she found herself increasingly cut off from the interests and amusements which made up the stuff of his daily life. Inevitably, they spent more and more time away from one another, and they drifted slightly apart. Taking into account both the princess's deafness and the prince's infidelity, it's remarkable that the gap which widened between them never became impassable. In the summer of 1867, however, all of this was still in the future. Only slight signs of deafness had yet appeared, the chief trouble being the rheumatic knee, which remained obstinately stiff. It was decided to try a cure at the German spa, and on 18th of August the prince and princess started for Wiesbaden, accompanied by their 3 children, their complete household, and 25 servants. They sailed in the royal yacht Osborne as far as Dordrecht, where they spent Sunday. The sailors' sing-song profaning the Sabbath evening shocked Sir William Knollys. The sailors of the Osborne had as usual been singing the 2 previous nights, and Lord Henry Lennox persuaded the princess to ask for it again. As it was Sunday, I suggested that it would not only scandalize Protestant Dordrecht, but it might also be objectionable to the sailors themselves. I had heard the songs and knew that there was one that was very objectionable to be sung before modest women. I was, however, overruled. I consoled myself in trusting that the princess only heard half the song and only half understood its meaning, but the princess seemed seriously annoyed with me for trying to get her away before this objectionable song was sung. Although deafness may have had something to do with her determination to listen to this improper song, all her life the princess could not refrain from gently teasing anyone who was pompous or a prude. So I'm going to end the video here. In this episode, we found out that the prince was a childish man, even at the age of 26, and that is why he could not be the husband that would stay by his wife's side 24/7. Princess Alexandra may have known her husband wasn't faithful. It was neglect that got to her. Everyone knew he was out having a good time with everybody else while she was at home suffering from a serious illness. It was also at this time that we found out the princess was starting to go deaf because of the illness, and it's so heartbreaking to hear that. She was able to disguise it for a while with the help of her friends, and she loved to spend time in nature with the dogs and the horses, and I can't say I blame her. And she also spent time at home with her children. She sounded like a great lady, and she had to contend with so much in her young life. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't subscribed, if you could do so, it would help the channel to grow, as well as giving it a thumbs up. It's all a great help. And if you haven't clicked on the notification bell, if you could do that, it lets you know when a video is posted. If you happen to see the search button below the video, if you could click on it, it will help grow my channel. I also want to thank all the subscribers I have now, and I'm glad you share a love of the English royal history just as I do. And it's fun to learn all about these interesting people. More importantly, I want to wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.